Hey, I've got an exciting episode of Terror at Collinwood for you today, featuring my guest, Danny Horn of the Dark Shadows Everyday blog and the Superheroes Everyday podcast. I can't wait for you to hear it. But before we get to that, I want to tell you about a few things coming up, some news bits. I will be doing an appearance as Penny Dreadful at the Monster Expo convention on October 14th and 15th, 2023 at the Taunton Conference Center in Taunton, Massachusetts. And I was also asked to present a panel devoted to Dark Shadows. That's right, it's a Dark Shadows 101 panel, if you will. It is Dark Shadows, TV's gothic horror classic. So it's a basic overview of the show, the characters, the legacy, etc. So please do attend the panel if you plan to be at Monster Expo. That's going to be on Saturday at 3 p.m. and they're going to have screens with the panel information at the convention. And otherwise, I will be at my table all weekend, Saturday and Sunday, the 14th and 15th. I'll have Shilling Shockers DVDs. I'll have some Terror at Collinwood stickers, which I will give you if you subscribe to the podcast. You get it free. I don't sell those stickers, but the trade-off is you got to subscribe to get one of those stickers. So you can do it right in front of me. If you subscribe, or if you should tell me that you're subscribed, I'll give you a Terror at Collinwood sticker. Moving on, very exciting things. There's going to be a Dark Shadows meet and greet at Lyndhurst in Tarrytown. Of course, that was the mansion used in House and in Night of Dark Shadows. And the meet and greet will feature Catherine Lee Scott and Marie Wallace. So that's going to be happening on Saturday and Sunday, October 21st and 22nd, 2023. They're going to have one meet and greet at 10:30 a.m. and another one at 1 p.m. on both days, and that'll be at the Lyndhurst Welcome Center. Tickets are $50 per person plus service fees. So you want to get on that. That's going to be a really exciting event. Speaking of exciting, Stuart Manning has announced that issue 2 of Daytime Gothic is coming. He is looking for submissions, and if you saw the first issue of Daytime Gothic, it's absolutely gorgeous, and I'm sure the second issue will be just as gorgeous, and I know there are going to be some really cool articles in there. Stuart especially is looking for fan art and fan fiction submissions. I don't think he's gotten as many of those as non-fiction articles, so if you're a fan artist or a fan fiction writer, please drop him a line at collinwood80@gmail.com. He is looking for submissions, and you can pitch your idea to Stuart at collinwood80@gmail.com. And then also another fantastic publication that's coming is Our Shadowed Past Volume 2. So two Volume 2s here of two really cool things. If you have Volume 1 of Our Shadowed Past, you know how beautiful that is. And all of the rich and diverse fan memories through the years of fans who ran home from school to watch Dark Shadows, all the way up to those who discovered it on streaming and everything in between. Great memories, great insights, all throughout that book, which is now available on Kindle on Amazon. Well, Bob Issel, who is the mastermind behind this, along with Jeff Kenny, they're looking for submissions for that. So if you want to write up an article about your memories of running home from school to watch Dark Shadows, or discovering it on VHS or on the Sci-Fi Channel or on streaming, whatever it is, your feelings about the show, the characters, the movies, the Ross novels, whatever, Gold Key comics, whatever you want to talk about. Bob is looking for submissions, and you can write to him and touch base about that and inquire at bobubas59@gmail.com. So that's BOBUBAS59@gmail.com. And I think that's all the news, so let's get to the show. There's nowhere to run, there's no place to hide. This podcast is fun, but there are spoilers inside. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Penny Dreadful, aka Danielle, and I am thrilled to have my guest here today. It is, of course, the one and only Danny Horn, who is the host of the Superheroes Everyday podcast and is the writer of the corresponding Superheroes Everyday blog. Danny's previous blog is well known to Dark Shadows fans. Of course, I'm talking about the Dark Shadows Everyday blog, which explored Dark Shadows episode by episode, starting with the release of Barnabas in episode 210, all the way through to episode 1225. The blog also featured many side trips into behind-the-scenes happenings, licensed media, merchandise, and remakes. He also founded the Muppet fan site Tough Pigs and co-founded Muppet Wiki, a detailed compendium of all knowledge about the Muppets and Jim Henson. By day, Danny is a director of product management at the Wikimedia Foundation, the nonprofit organization behind Wikipedia. By night and weekend, he promotes truth and justice through the unlikely medium of his blog and podcast about superhero movies. Welcome to the show, Danny.
Oh, thank you so much, Danielle. I'm really, really glad to be here.
Oh gosh, it's my pleasure to have you here. I was telling you right before we started recording that, I get a lot of requests from fans for guests on the show, and I probably at the top of the list is our actors from the show, but right after that, I mean, it's you're right up next on the list. Like frequently I get messages from fans and posts.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're gonna have the Dark Shadows Everyday guy on your
Great.
podcast, or they might mention you by name. So I've been meaning to reach out to you for a while, so I'm glad to have you here.
I'm so delighted to be here. I haven't had a
So
chance to talk to Dark Shadows fans for a little while, so
yeah.
fantastic.
So I want to talk to you first before we get into the dark and shadowy topics. I want to talk to you about superheroes. My Uncle Valdemar, who I mention often on this show, my Uncle Val, he introduced me to Dark Shadows and classic horror films of Universal, Hammer, Vincent Price films. But he also introduced me to a lot of other cool stuff, including 50s and 60s rock and roll and superheroes. He gave me a bunch of comic books when I was a kid. We used to watch the Incredible Hulk TV series together, and Wonder Woman, and the
Yeah.
George Reeves Superman, Christopher Reeves Superman movies, all of that. So we went to see Batman together, Batman '89 together, the Adam West Batman series. So I was excited to see that after you. I was sad that you ended your run with Dark Shadows, but I was excited to see that you were doing superheroes, which is another thing I enjoy. So and I've enjoyed listening to your podcast. So can you talk a little bit about your passion for superheroes, your love of superheroes, and why it led to doing this podcast and blog about superheroes?
Sure. It's actually it is similar to my love for Dark Shadows and the idea for Superheroes Everyday blog. Kind of obviously it came out of the Dark Shadows Everyday blog. In that, the thing that I love about Dark Shadows is the serialized narrative, long-running serialized narrative, and kind of figuring out how those stories work, how characters work over time, and how things evolve according to how the audience is responding to it. And so when I finished with Dark Shadows, I wanted to tell a similar kind of story, and superhero movies is another story like that, where there's been, a million parts, and you can kind of see the evolution along with the way that people are appreciating it or understanding it.
You have a really fun sort of comedic bent to it, or you dive into the films, these superhero films, but you also have kind of an irreverent quality to it.
There's a lot of them. I'm making fun of the film,
yeah,
because it turns out that quite a few of them are stupid, and even the ones that but it's always silly because it's fantasy and it's big blockbuster, and so there's always silly stuff about it. And I do it. The podcast especially is more a comedy podcast than anything else.
Well, I agree with I was listening to your discussion about the Joss Whedon version of the Justice League, and I kept saying yes, like through the whole thing, because all you talked about the Joss Whedon Justice League, but then when the Snyder cut came out of the Justice League movie, all these people were like, "Oh, the Snyder cut's so much better," and I watched it, and I was like, "It's not better; it's just longer. It's equally bad. It's just." I know I've seen you talk about Superman before, wear a Superman t-shirt, which is another character I think Zack Snyder knows nothing about.
Got wrong.
It's like Superman is hope and optimism. He's not like this brooding god, detached god. It's like, come on. Is Superman your favorite superhero?
Yeah, Superman and Spider-Man are
And
the two.
Spider-Man. Yeah.
Yeah, where I've really dug in and know a lot about and read all of the, all of the stuff going back to for Spider-Man the 60s and for
Hmm.
Superman back to like the 40s and 50s.
Hmm.
Um, even more than actually like Superman I find baffling. DC I find baffling these days.
Yeah.
About like what's in continuity and what's actually going on in those. Spider-Man has continued to kind of keep it real.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm glad that you pointed up to a DC and a Marvel characters. I love DC and Marvel. Like I don't.
yeah,
People always, oh, do you love DC or Marvel? But I agree with you. I don't read much in terms of the current comics. There was a period where I was really into Batman, and I collected the Batman comics. I was really into those.
yeah,
But I always loved picking up some Marvel comics and or other DC characters and reading those. So I mean, I don't think you have to pick a side. You can enjoy
right. Oh yeah,
stuff from
no,
both. Definitely. The serialized aspect of superhero comics.
yeah,
Um, I've heard this same people say the same thing about Dark Shadows. It's like I don't know where to start. Like I don't know where to jump
yeah.
in. And it's kind of like
Oh,
that with comics now. Like everything seems to be serialized now. And I think you
mhm.
mentioned this in your Dark Shadows blog about genre television now tends to be serialized. Can
Everything
you
is a soap opera now. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Can we talk a little bit about that? Like, would you say Dark Shadows is kind of groundbreaking in that regard for as far as genre television?
I'm so sorry. You can hear my cat probably
Your
going in
cat?
the back. Yeah, you're not
I
hearing
can't.
that?
No, no, but
Fantastic.
that
All
will
right, good.
add to the effect if
All
we can
right,
hear your cat.
he's a black cat actually.
Oh,
So
awesome.
howling in the distance. All right, so that's good. Fantastic. It'll just be atmosphere if it does come through.
What's your cat's
Um,
name? What's your cat's name?
Luke.
Luke.
Yeah,
Oh.
he does not have a Dark Shadowsy name. Um, uh, well, so a thing that I find super fascinating about Dark Shadows is that it is a soap opera. Um it follows those rules, it follows those patterns, and um and what happens over time is, at first it kind of embraces the craziness of that,
Mhm,
and then after a while, sort of towards the end of the series, they start kind of breaking soap opera rules,
mhm,
which I think actually kind of contributes to the show's decline at the end. The fun thing about soap operas, and kind of the reason why soap operas have taken over TV, is soap operas are all about continuing a story over many parts. You have to pay attention, and there are like overlapping storylines that happen either like for soap operas, daytime soap operas across years, for shows now just across seasons. You're supposed to be paying attention to sort of the character interactions and following different character stories over time.
mhm,
That used to just not be true at all on nighttime TV. It has really changed now because uh, partly because of like VHS and DVD and DVRs and now streaming made it kind of more possible for people to catch up on shows if they haven't been watching.
mhm,
Um, because initially, sort of a lot of primetime nightly show or weekly shows would just be episodic. There wouldn't be sort of like characters that you would follow over time or storylines that you would follow over time, because they didn't have any faith that people like watched every single episode,
mhm.
um, or would remember across weeks, across episodes.
Right.
Once we've got VHS and kind of the ability of people in the audience to catch up and to kind of keep current, then the writers are able to kind of create more complicated soap opera type storylines.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and so I'm sorry. And so like genre TV
Yeah.
has entirely become that. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was very important in that, sort of taking weekly genre TV and doing kind of like what Dark Shadows did, which is treating all of the fantasy parts, all of the horror parts as metaphor,
Mhm.
and having that drive character based stories.
Excellent. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it's become a staple now. I mean, all of these television shows now, like The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
or even what any of those Netflix series like Stranger
Yeah.
Things or HBO or Game of Thrones, anything that's horror, fantasy, sci-fi does tend to follow that serialized storytelling
Yep.
format. Uh,
Everything's got a big bad, everything, and there's like character and relationships that last over the course of seasons.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to circle back to the soap opera thing
Yeah.
in just a little bit, but um and anything else you want to say about superheroes before we seg over to Dark Shadows?
No, let's talk Dark Shadows. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
well, people should check out the Superheroes Everyday podcast.
Yeah.
It's really funny. It's every episode is a specific superhero movie, which I talk about in 3 parts, as per the Sid Field 3-act structure. We go through the movie and basically make jokes about it, and it's really fun. People should check it out.
Yeah. I loved your analysis with Stewart of Batman and Robin.
Yes.
Which
yes, Stuart Manning's been on the show. It's
yeah.
Sort of related to Dark Shadows people. Like Stuart Manning's been on the show. Joe Lidster, who produced all the Big Finish Dark Shadows stories. He was on an episode about Morbius, which is the vampire, not superhero movie.
Yeah.
People should come and check that out. Yeah,
and,
they are very funny.
And you have Laramie Dean, I think, coming on.
Oh yeah, and Laramie Dean is just, he's on the one that's just releasing this week.
Yeah, I've had Laramie on the podcast, and I've had Stuart, and Stuart's coming back on to talk about Daytime Gothic too.
Oh, great.
So he's coming back on. I haven't had Joe Lister on yet, but I got to have him on at some point if he wants to do it. It's great. I'm, as a Batman fan, I've told you in email, when I saw Batman and Robin for the first time in the theater.
Yeah.
I was I can't really explain my reaction. It wasn't as bad as my reaction to the Johnny Depp Dark Shadows movie when I saw that, which was just I just was like sad. When I when I saw the Batman and Robin movie, it was kind of like, what did I just?
Yeah,
it's like an explosion of color. But I do love, to this day, I do love Arnold's Mr. Freeze.
He's great.
He was great. I mean, I will always adore the animated series version, which was very tragic, where Paul Dini kind of rewrote him and reinvented the character for the animated series. I also love the Adam West, especially the Autumn Preminger version of Mr. Freeze, which I guess the Arnold version was kind of a throwback to the like a more buff version of with the ice puns and everything. But anyway, so Dark Shadows. Okay.
Yes.
Your blog is quite legendary among Dark Shadows fans. Like I said, I hear about it. People always bring it up. So talk a little bit about how you got into Dark Shadows in the first place. How did you discover Dark Shadows?
Dark Shadows came along at just the right time for me. I think I was 13 years old, and I lived in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, back in the late 1980s, New Jersey Network, the public TV station, really rescued Dark Shadows and brought episodes of Dark Shadows out that had never been rerun before. I don't know if you know any of this, like the syndication.
Oh, I do. I was right there.
There.
I was right there. Yep. In the 80s, we had it up here in Massachusetts out of Vineyard Haven, and they also carried it up until the end of the syndication package. So into 1970 parallel time.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so I did get to see up to the end of the syndication package, and I remember it was like a lost cause almost. Like, are we ever going to see that last year of Dark Shadows? And the 1840 concordance was our only way to kind of know about that, But and then finally MPI kind of saved the day with the VHS and then the Sci-Fi Channel. So yeah, I totally
this is before all of that stuff, and definitely before. I mean, it's such an amazing, thinking back on those late 80s days when these episodes were so precious, and we, there were things that we couldn't see. The fact that people can see everything now on demand is just amazing, and I'm really happy for Dark Shadows fans now to be able to go through the whole series like that. Absolutely. So I started when I was 13, and was kind of like David and Amy's age as they discovered Quentin's ghost and his the box. What was it? The crib in the West Wing and the coffin that was buried. I just connected. I think 1897. So New Jersey Network was the first to have the 1897 year, and then the Leviathan and Parallel Time year. And I just absolutely I watched the show on and off before that, but once it got into 1897. I just absolutely fell in love with everything about the show.
Were you a fan of like spooky stuff, like Monster Kid stuff? No,
no, my brother was. He was into like the monster movies. I was into like the Muppets and Disney, and Doctor Who. That was the other big one
Doctor
for me
Who
at the time, and which was also on public TV.
Right. And also serialized. Well, I guess within
Yeah.
its stories, the individual stories would be serialized. So there is
Mm.
that link as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have friends, it's funny, I have friends who are really into Doctor Who, and they love early Doctor Who, but they couldn't get into Dark Shadows. And I was like, I don't think it's a far cry from early
Right.
Doctor Who to Dark Shadows. It's
You have to make kind of the same mental adjustments in your head
right.
to just say, I know I'm watching 1960s television. It was different. The pace is different. The sets are different. You have to be able to like look past that and see like the passion and what people are actually bringing to that.
Exactly.
And the same
Yeah.
is true with Doctor Who, basically through the entire series.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable that they were able to pull off what they pulled off on a
Yeah,
on a daily basis with Dark Shadows. I mean, every day they were cranking out these shows with these amazing theater actors, that
yeah,
were just so unique. And
yeah,
yeah. So you got into watching it on the New Jersey network.
yeah.
Did you
Actually,
and
now that
you
I think about it, I saw the early Barnabas episodes first.
oh,
I was even
okay.
younger. I was like in fifth grade. When NBC in New York
Hmm.
showed it must have been the first 6 months, maybe. I,
Yeah.
I think it was the first 6 months. And so I watched those and I was just kind of fascinated and confused by that whole experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that really stuck with me. So when I found it next on New Jersey Network a few years later, I really, really connected.
So it rang a bell from when you watched it
Mm-hmm.
before, and you're like, oh, this was the thing. Um,
Yeah.
did were you watching? So you weren't really into the classic horror stuff. Were you watching soap operas at that time? Like that's another. There are different audiences for Dark Shadows, which I always
Yeah.
find fascinating because you have the horror classic horror crowd that's into it, and you have the soap opera fans, and not to put people in boxes, but I'm just curious, like what was
I
there?
think I I think my like the way that I would get into Dark Shadow, like the thing that appealed to me and what that corresponded to was Doctor Who.
Yeah.
And because the thing that I love about both of those shows is the ability to go and just do anything.
Mhm.
For them to be for the creators to be amazingly creative and put out like and reach for whatever it is that they could possibly think of, and sometimes their reach exceeds their grasp, sometimes they nail it, sometimes they really don't nail it, but it's always interesting, it's always like creative and new and special. And definitely in a world, in the 1980s when normal TV, when network TV was super boring.
Yeah.
It was always the same thing all the time. Like every show would be the same, for every episode. That seeing Dark Shadows going from the 1960s to 1795, starting including ghosts and werewolves and everything that they could like throw at the screen. That was the thing that connected with me, and that's the same kind of. The Muppets was my early love, and Doctor Who and Dark Shadows kind of all have that feeling.
Yeah. Excellent. One thing I found, like you mentioned the 80s and discovering and watching Dark Shadows on NBC and then the New Jersey Network. Um, I also remember in the 80s, like in high school, it was a weird time to be at because I was so passionate about Dark Shadows. And
Yeah,
I discovered the fandom at around that time too. I have eventually found out about
the
Shadowgram and
magazines.
the World of
Yeah,
Dark Shadows, and that was my into the fandom. But
yeah,
like none of my friends in high school, and it didn't seem like anybody. It was weird because Dark Shadows was such a
yeah.
huge phenomenon in the
Hmm.
'60s, huge
Yeah,
pop culture phenomenon, and then it's like, then Gen X comes along, and it's like, you guys don't know. How do you not know about this thing?
right.
Did you have
Yeah.
that a similar experience to that or
Oh
not?
yeah, absolutely. No, I don't think I knew anybody in high school. Like when I was really into Dark Shadows, I don't remember anybody else ever being interested in it at all. Yeah, it's super mysterious that it was so big. It burned very, very brightly for a few years in the late 1960s. And then once it was gone, it really kind of disappeared from the earth and it disappeared from people's consciousness.
It's so weird. And
Yeah.
I saw it described on, I was Reddit. Somebody described it as the missing link of genre television.
Yeah.
and I,
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
it's like, because it was so pivotal in so many ways and influential in a lot of ways. And
Yeah.
it's like, how did this happen? And it went into syndication, but maybe because it was so immense, it
Yeah.
was difficult for stations to kind of keep
Oh yeah,
showing.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it was a big problem that, Star Trek actually didn't do that well in the ratings, especially their third season, and then they got
Mm-hmm.
taken off the air. When Star Trek really became like Star Trek as people know it, that was in syndication.
Mm-hmm.
When they took all the episodes and just ran them and ran them and ran them every afternoon in the 70s and into the 80s. And because they had what, like 92 episodes, probably. I'm probably wrong,
So
but some,
something, yeah.
something like something in that area. So you could just like run them forever. Whereas Dark Shadows, you've got 1,200 episodes, and nobody really knew how to syndicate a show that was 1,200 episodes. It's a huge commitment, and the idea that people are going to watch every day. So it found a home on public TV where they didn't have to worry that much about the ratings, as long as there were passionate people who really wanted to support it.
And they'd have to keep track of running it in order, because I remember
Right.
channel 58, which was like a UHF channel. I remember sometimes they would play an episode out of order, like it was
Yeah,
I
which you
think it
cannot
was,
do.
yeah, it was like it was during the werewolf and Quentin's ghost storyline, I think, and then all of a sudden there was an 1897 episode, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, we're going to 1897, cool. It's like it was just randomly dropped in, so it
Yeah.
was confusing. So okay, so how did you discover the fandom then? Was it also through the fanzines? I
The
think I do
magazines.
remember you
Yeah.
talking about Kathy Resch, who I've had on the podcast as well, and I
Oh,
loved The World
fantastic.
of Dark Shadows. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was such an iconic fan publication that ran for decades. Was that your in was the fanzines?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there was like a cult TV book, and it had the address
Mm-hmm.
for World of Dark Shadows. And yeah, it really like opened everything up. All of a sudden I had people to talk to.
Uh-huh.
Um, it was, for us, it was like that was the forum, that was the Facebook group, that was the Twitter group, like that was how you connected with other people who really loved the show.
Mm-hmm.
Except it happened like once every 4 months, maybe. um you know so there were things that like letters that I'd written, and kind of responses people that I'd
Yeah.
that I'd written, and so there was kind of like a back and forth,
Mm-hmm.
as you would get like on the internet now, except instead of like sending it and getting a response back, you send it and then you wait 4 months for the
Yes.
response to come back in the mail, all
Yes.
typed up.
Yes.
But they were absolutely brilliant. I actually still I've got them within easy reach,
Oh,
are all
nice.
of my World of Dark Shadows and Inside the Old House and all the
Yes.
fanzines. They were just so brilliant.
Oh, I love
Um,
those. Yeah.
and I'm so delighted that Stuart Manning is doing the Daytime Gothic
Mm-hmm.
magazines now, like bringing back a print scene. It's so exciting. And so I wrote something for the first issue, and I'm writing something right now for the second issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like,
Great.
because I have that love of the print scenes from the 80s and 90s. I'm so excited to be like, and they're so beautiful.
Oh, they're
Those
gorgeous.
fanzines are fantastic.
Yeah.
And so to be a part of that has been really special for me too.
Yeah, agreed. I was really excited when Stuart announced that he was bringing that back, and I also have a piece in the first
Great.
issue,
Yeah, you do.
and I will in the second issue as well. So
Awesome.
excited about that. So I wrote the 10 Gothic tales that could have been used in Dark Shadows had the series
Oh yeah.
continue. Yeah, so because
Oh,
I
that's
always
you. Oh,
thought it was a
fantastic. Yeah.
cop out, when Dan Curtis and the writers like Sam Hall and stuff be like, oh, we just ran
There's
out
no
of
more stories.
ideas. I'm
Yeah.
like, that's not true. Come on. You guys are just burned out from doing
Yeah.
Dan Curtis wanted to go make movies in Hollywood.
Mhm.
So I mean there were plenty of other tales they could have woven into the mix there.
Yeah.
So okay. So you discovered the fandom. Now let's jump ahead here. How did you come up with the uh, I know you were really into the Muppets, and you did a
Mhm.
lot in the Muppets fandom, which is
Yes.
awesome. I remember the Muppet Show in the 70s and
Yeah.
going into the 80s, and I mean those iconic characters, and I think that's really cool that you contributed so heavily to the Muppets fandom in such a key way. Um,
Yeah, that was my print scene.
okay,
In 1992, I made a zine called Muppet Scene, which
uh-huh.
ran for 5 years, and was the first like real adult Muppet fandom thing, and kind of
Mm,
like brought Muppet fans together for the first time.
that's great.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and then in 1997 there was the internet, and it was very silly to like print things and photocopy them and send them out through the mail.
Yeah, that the
So then it
internet.
turned into then it yeah then it turned into websites.
Yeah, the internet it did kind of kill the print fanzine, and it's it was such an exciting thing to get one of those in the mail. Like you'd
Yeah,
see that envelope come in, it was like, oh, it's one of the zines. And I'm glad, like you said, Stuart bringing that back is such a great thing,
it's
and
really
I
fun.
love that you did a Muppet fanzine. Did you get a lot of subscribers for it?
Yes, considering, yeah, there must have been it was in the hundreds,
Wow,
which
wow.
doesn't seem like a lot, uh, but at the time was
Well, for one person to handle
a
that.
lot to put in the mail.
Yeah, I was
Um,
gonna say that's a labor of love, definitely
oh yeah, it
to
was for sure.
yeah. As is the Dark Shadows Everyday blog,
Yes.
because that was an immense undertaking to cover all of those episodes. So what prompted you to do that?
I wanted to do some kind of like big long running writing project, which I hadn't really done. And I wanted to just see if I could do it and if it would be fun and if I could get better at it. Um, and so there's a lot of, with Doctor Who as being another kind of major fandom of mine, there's several different texts that where people are like watching all of Doctor Who and writing about all of Doctor Who. And there were starting to be like podcasts also that would do like, here's, Star Wars, 1 minute at a time. And I really liked that format. And then Dark Shadows, nobody had done that.
Mhm.
Um, and so I decided it would be fun to try out. And I figured nobody would ever read it. So I could basically just do whatever I wanted. And then was really delighted to find that it now is like accompanying people as they're watching the show. I hear that a lot of like on their Shadows journey, that they'll watch
Absolutely.
it. Yeah. So I really didn't know what I was doing in those early episodes. But kind of figured out what I wanted to say about the character and about the stylish and the process of the show. Like that was the thing that was really important and interesting to me, is like, can we figure out what was happening with the writers, what was happening like with the producer as it's getting filtered out through the show.
Mhm.
um, that was the thing that super fascinated me. And and then after a while, as the show got weirder, the blog got weirder. And I don't know, people have seen that. uh and something that is so wonderful for me about the readers of Dark Shadows every day is people just encourage that. They encourage me to just do my own dream sequences in the blog.
Yeah, you
um
did. You did do that. Yeah, like some kind of fanfic type stuff. To,
yeah, and tell
yeah.
some stories about minor characters, and just to
Mhm.
get and to have kind of at a certain point, especially towards the end, like my own running like subplot, stealing characters along the way from that were dropped in different storylines and kind of putting them together and seeing what happens there.
Right.
um and then I ended up casting a magic spell. um
Yes.
I cast a spell, I believe it was to make Trump lose the
Oh,
election.
yes. Yes.
And it worked. I was so happy. Yeah, I
Yes.
cast it was me and the Dark Shadows kaiju went back in time, and we had our and we there was a post where I am casting that spell. Um
Mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. It totally worked. Um yeah, so it was, and so what's lovely is just like Dark Shadows people are so amazing and forgiving and weird, but really kind of went with me on the weird stuff that I ended up doing. And I
Yeah.
just had a blast doing it. It's
Yeah.
writing the blog. I miss it. It was such great fun.
Yeah. I mean,
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
and also like covering things like the Gold Key novels. So every once in a while, for folks who haven't seen the blog, um, if there's an episode where I really didn't have that much to say, I would go and talk about something else.
Mhm.
And so that would be like an issue with a comic book that was coming out around the time that I'm writing about, or the Gold Key novel that was coming out that month. It's so much fun kind of like delving into that whole range of crazy spin-offery,
Yeah.
within sort of the timeline of the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also talked about like real life things that were going on, like Jonathan Frid doing his tours,
Oh yeah,
and you'd reference that throughout and
yeah.
bring that back up, and just and then you'd cover the reboots and the remakes and
Mhm.
address those and do write ups on those. So it was fun seeing you take side trips into
Yes. Yeah.
the periphery of Dark Shadows, the orbit of Dark Shadows. I pulled some quotes from your blog that I want to
Okay.
bring up and talk
Sweet.
about. But I also want to just ask you, because this is something I mentioned it. You did the whole thing where you went back in time to Never Too Young. Like, this is what happens when you try to go back to the beginning and you wind up in the Tony Dow
Yes.
show that was on before Dark Shadows. Um, why not? Why didn't you cover the pre-Barnabas episodes?
I didn't because for me and for like for like the rerun generation, the show started at 210.
Mm-hmm.
That was where the rerun started, was Barnabas coming out of the box. Everything before that was sort of mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
And um and so it was 210, like for every time it started on public TV, they started 210.
Yeah.
And the concordances, mostly, like, it was a while before we got like a 1966 concordance. And then when like the VHS releases started, that started with 210 as well. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's probably the thing that made me say, like, you know what, 210 is the start. This is where the show really begins.
Okay.
Everything before that is prehistory.
Okay.
And I didn't want to write 200 posts about a period of the show that I just think is kind of boring.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Other people have done that now, and Asilius is doing his own blog, where he went back all the way to the beginning and has found interesting stuff all the way through.
Yeah.
But for me, the story started at 210,
Gotcha.
and then continues until the end.
Gotcha. Yeah. I didn't get to watch, like many of us, we didn't get to watch it until Dark Shadows, the collector's series, I think, on VHS from
Mm.
MPI. They released those after they released
Yeah,
the.
exactly. Yeah.
So I did watch those, and I enjoyed them. I mean, they're not my favorite
Hmm.
storylines, but I did enjoy them. I liked the slow build up to, it's like, okay, you can start to see
Yeah.
the hints of the supernatural. Is this a metaphor, or is this really? And then it just starts to build up, and then and I really enjoyed the Laura storyline. I
Hmm.
thought this Laura storyline was really cool. It was like
She's
the
cool.
the prelude to Barnabas. Almost, it was the first supernatural antagonist in the show, so it was kind of
Right.
cool. And then when they brought her back, and that must have been
Hmm.
really cool for those who did the probably
Oh yeah.
12
Yeah.
people who were watching Barnabas episodes in the 60s to see her come back. That must have been
Yeah.
kind of a cool thing. Like, oh my
Oh
God,
yeah.
it's David's mother and
I
also
think
his
I think
grandmother.
for us and for all the Dark Shadows fans, that exist now, like I said, like, you have to make some mental adjustments. And when you watch like old Doctor Who or old Dark Shadows, or really
Mm.
any like really old TV, to say, I'm going to accept how this is. And I think for the pre-Barnabas episodes, like, that's an extra adjustment that you have to make, is like, not only am I watching this crazy show, but this 60s show, but also this is the period that was real slow, when when these storylines would just drag out forever. You have to kind of like decide that before you then go and consciously enjoy the 1966 episodes.
Right. And those I will say I like too that you get to know those characters a little better. I mean, they
Mm.
change and evolve and become better people, like over time. Well, Roger was pretty rotten in those
Yeah.
pre-Barnabas, and David was a incipient psychopath, as Roger called. But they kind of, a lot of those, that core family, once the monster show starts, they kind of get
Yeah,
turned
absolutely.
into victims more, and they're in
Hmm.
kind of in the background, and they're always there, and it's comforting to have them there. They're always there, but they
Yeah.
become the victims, and the
Hmm.
the monsters become the protagonists of the show, which is a hugely, I think, groundbreaking thing
Hmm.
for that Dark Shadows did. Now all these, like you mentioned, Buffy, like, a character like Angel,
Yep.
I don't think would have existed
Oh
if
yeah,
it weren't
absolutely.
for Barnabas.
Yeah, and True Blood, and even
Oh
I
yeah.
think like Interview with a Vampire, the way it's done
Oh yes.
now,
Yeah.
is also owes a lot to the Barnabas as the kind of reformed vampire.
Yeah. Anne Rice was a Dark Shadows fan.
Yeah.
She's on record as saying that. So let's talk. I'm gonna pull. So I pulled some quotes here. We're talking about Barnabas here. So one thing I really appreciate about your blog is your take on Barnabas Collins. A lot of fans look at Dark Shadows, and it's a very subjective thing. I mean,
Mhm.
some people look at it and they see one thing, some people look at it and they see something else.
Right.
A lot of fans have a tendency, I think, to see Barnabas as um, as a hero, the hero of the
Right.
show,
The hero of the story. Yeah.
a superhero.
Especially a romantic hero. Yeah.
A romantic hero, or people want to care for Barnabas. They want Barnabas to be happy, etc.
Yeah.
You don't wear rose-colored glasses when it comes to Barnabas.
Barnabas is a mess.
He is, and I pulled this quote.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that's why we love Barnabas. I
Yeah,
adore.
I
He's
know.
my
Yeah,
favorite
that's what I
fictional
love about him.
character. I love Barnabas, but I love the light and dark in that character, the interplay of
Mhm.
the dumpster fire that is Barnabas Collins, and Jonathan Frid did too. He loved playing that, but um Barnabas is absolutely not a good guy. He never is at any point in the original series, the 91 series, the trading cards, the Viewmaster reels, the Big Finish audios, or any other version of the show that people like. He is an insane, self absorbed nightmare machine who reluctantly chooses to destroy everyone's lives over and over again because he's decided that he's in love with some girl or because someone is annoying him. He will do absolutely anything to satisfy his whims and appetites and evade punishment for his many grisly crimes. Also, he thinks that he's the hero. This is why we like him. You nailed it there.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, I love Barnabas, and sometimes people are like, "Well, do you not like Barnabas?" No, I love Barnabas, but that's
Yeah.
you described why. I think sometimes people are a little like they feel ashamed or something to like someone, a vampire who's
Right.
a mass murderer. Barnabas
Yeah.
is a mass murderer. And you feel for Barnabas. There's a sadness to him,
Mhm.
but he's also extremely
He
damaged
just
character.
he just chooses. I think especially when you get to Roxanne, he just like randomly chooses a girl to be in love with,
Yeah.
and then that colors everything that he does from that point. Like at that point, that it doesn't even really make sense
Mm.
that he would do this. I think the thing that's interesting is that people mistake main character for hero. There are a ton of what I call the kaiju, like the really what turn out to be the main characters of Dark
Yeah.
Shadows is Barnabas and Julia, Quentin and Angelique,
Yeah.
and then to some degree Gerard towards
Mm-hmm.
the end. None of those people are heroes; they're all villains,
Yeah.
and that is the fun thing about Dark Shadows is that people just really connected so strongly to these villain characters that they became not heroes but main characters, like the people
Mm-hmm.
that you want to see the most, the people who drive the action, the ones who even when other characters like drop in and out, like those stay. um and and so he doesn't have to be a hero, he doesn't have to be a good guy. Good guy is completely irrelevant to him. He kills people all of the time in every storyline. Sometimes he has a justification for that, sometimes he does not, but like he is a murderer. All of those people are murderers.
Yeah.
um we just like them.
Mm-hmm.
um but
He
that
was
doesn't mean that they're good.
Yeah, I heard Barnabas described, I think it was in the Dark Shadows forums years ago. Barnabas is the judge, jury, and executioner.
Yeah.
Every time he's the one
Yes. Yeah.
he makes the call. But all of those characters, like you said, those characters represent the other, and they become the protagonists of the show. And they're
Yeah.
not heroes in the traditional sense. I think some people
Yeah.
identify with those characters sometimes, and they're like, oh, they're the good ones, but they're maybe anti-heroes. You
Mhm.
could maybe argue that because there is, I mean,
They're trying to stop, especially like towards the end, they're trying to stop people who want to destroy the family.
yes, and you
um
mentioned the kaiju thing, but that's
mhm.
exactly it. Yeah. And I pulled a quote about that too.
Okay.
In his first movie in 1954, Godzilla was a horrifying nuclear age monster stomping through Tokyo as a cinematic reenactment of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was a punishment sent to remind everyone not to mess around with atom bombs. At the end of the movie, Godzilla chokes to death underwater and then disintegrates, and everyone cheers. But people liked him. At a certain scale, larger than life monsters become more exciting than scary. So he revived for one sequel after another, and it wasn't long before Godzilla was the hero monster, defending the people of Japan from the villain monsters. That and that's is
That's
what
exactly what happened to
happens.
Barnabas. Yeah.
Yeah, with Barnabas and all of those, even like you mentioned, Angelique. People always, I think a lot of times modern media depictions of Angelique tend to be kind of one dimensional. It's like, oh, she's the
Hmm.
antagonist, but in this
Right.
show, she actually also becomes this kind of shades of gray character where she
Yeah,
does
absolutely.
become an ally to Barnabas and Quentin and Julia at some point. But then, like you
Hmm.
said, for the 1840 storyline, you said one of my favorite
Kind of
quotes I
reboots
throw
her.
off. Yeah, yeah, she restored to factory settings. I love that quote.
Yeah.
but it's true. And that was kind of disappointing. It's like, well, why take I'd like to have
Yeah.
seen the Angelique that had kind of become an ally against the Leviathans and helped against Patofi and stuff. I mean, Angelique always has her own ulterior motives, as they
Mhm.
all do, but she became an ally to
Yeah.
them too. So it's
I mean, the thing that I really love about those four characters as the main characters, is that they are interesting anytime they're on screen. And
mhm,
when you take just two of those, especially like Barnabas and Julia together, are just dynamite every
mhm.
scene, always fun to watch. And Angelique and Barnabas standing around declaiming and talking about their relationship, I think is like, I don't think they have a bad scene in the whole show. Lots of other characters have bad scenes, but like there's never a bad Barnabas Angelique scene.
Agreed. Yeah.
Um, and because they are so dynamic and they'll do so much to like further the plot and the story.
Mhm.
And so, I know like in Leviathan, it's really nice when Angelique kind of joins with Julia, and helps to destroy the Leviathans and sort of becomes Julia's friend. I think that's really appealing, not because like, oh, it's Angelique becoming a good person or a hero. It's just she's just fun to watch hanging out with Julia. And so
Exactly.
if that turn towards like, okay, maybe I'll help you, gets us more like Julia Angelique scenes, then
Mhm.
we love that. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And I think you have a great understanding too of that as a comic fan, because
Hmm.
that happens in comics a lot. When a character
Yeah.
becomes a villain in the comics, becomes super popular, they tend to kind of go in that direct. We want to follow
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
story and what
That's like
they're up
Scarlet
to.
Witch and Quicksilver,
Yes.
as just one example of like, yeah, villains who were just fun to read about,
Right.
and move things along to the point where, okay, people really want to see these characters. We can't have them just be villain characters forever.
Yeah.
And so turn them into heroes, brought them into the Avengers.
Absolutely. You mentioned some great characters there, including Julia. And I know she's one of your favorite. Is she your favorite Dark Shadows
Yes,
character? Why
she
why
is.
so?
She is one of the best fictional characters in history. It's I don't even know who's on her level. The thing that's amazing about Julia is she is just a nonstop story machine. She's a real smart character, which means she doesn't get fooled by people. And because there's on Dark Shadows very much, the family can often be like goldfish. Um, they're
Yeah.
just swimming around the bowl, and every time they see a ghost, it's like the first time they've seen a ghost.
Mhm.
There's stuff way late where they're still pretending like that they don't know that ghosts exist. How is that possible? Look at your life. Julie always remembers everything, and she's always like a step ahead of everybody. And she's a trickster. Like she will come and lie or blackmail or do whatever she needs to do in order to get stuff done, and it always moves the story along in a really beautiful way. And that's I think is, as well as just like Grayson Hall and her facial expressions, like, and this is another thing of we love what looks interesting and we love the character that does interesting things.
Mhm.
And the way that Grayson Hall looks every single moment is its own weird picture. She's You can never predict what she's going to do.
Yeah.
And so that is why I love her.
Very really fun to watch. It's
Yeah.
she's yeah, agreed. Yeah. Um, Another quote I pulled from your blog, kind of relating to these interesting characters here. This one is actually in reference to Professor Stokes. You said, we're exactly a year into the vampire story this week, and this is the model for introducing new characters. Big, theatrical, high concept lunatics who couldn't appear anywhere else on television but here. They don't do small anymore. I think they've forgotten how. That's great. I agree, definitely.
And Stokes actually is an example of somebody who almost gets there. I
Yeah,
read about this, that like Stokes, he's amazing. He does the same thing of like every scene that Stokes walks into is now a Stokes scene.
yeah,
Um, and he's just going to take over and do crazy. He's going to like turn furniture upside down. He's going to do whatever he wants to
yeah.
do. Um, but they never let him in
I
to the
and
murder club.
but they can't. I don't think, because I don't think Stokes would be cool with what they did. Because Stokes, I think Stokes, he's kind of the Van Helsing of Dark Shadows, and I don't think from a moral standpoint,
Mhm.
if Stokes found out that Barnabas kept an innocent woman locked prisoner in his basement and vampirized people, and that
Yeah.
Quentin and murdered all these people. Julia was in on the murder of Dave Woodard, and Angelique murdered all. I mean, I don't think Stokes would be down with that, which is why I don't think they ever fully embrace Stokes into that group.
I agree, and unfortunately, like, but that's why he didn't become part of like that core cast. Basically because you can't have like Julia and Stokes scenes in the way that you have like Julia towards the end, Julia and Angelique scenes, where they dig each other and they're playing together. Stokes always was kind of kept on the outside. If the main characters are all going to be part of Murder Club, and Stokes can't be in that, then he just is never able to enter that circle, and he kind of fades away.
Right. And they have to keep blinders on him when it comes to like Barnabas and stuff. Like he's like, well, he's an expert in the occult, and kind of is a boss during that scene when he enters the dream curse and stuff. And it's like, how did he not figure out Barnabas is a vampire? And I remember in the fanzine days, there were theories about like, well, he did figure it out, but he didn't say anything because he figured out he was cured, but he doesn't seem to know that Barnabas is a vampire in 1995. He doesn't seem to have any knowledge of that. So I'm
not sure. I was just rereading my post on that because I'm writing something for Daytime Gothic, and I wanted to look back at some stuff I'd written. I don't know if Stokes knows why Quentin doesn't age in 1995.
Yeah, I think there's like
nobody pays attention to that.
No, you're right. Yeah. I guess Stokes has a lot of other things on his mind in 1995. He's like, I don't even want to think about that. I've already dealt with enough with this whole Gerard thing.
I live in Collinsport. Life is weird enough.
Yeah, right. Another thing I want to talk about, like you mentioned the soap opera thing, and the Dark Shadows. Like I was introduced to Dark Shadows by my uncle, who was a big monster kid in the 60s, and he loved Dark Shadows growing up when he moved from Portugal as a kid, and he got into Dark Shadows right away and Famous Monsters and all of that. And he introduced he never even mentioned that Dark Shadows was a soap opera. When I was a child, when I was a kid, I was like, oh, it's just this cool show with a lot of episodes that continues on. Because I had watched like some of All My Children for a few months with my mom, and I was like, that is nothing like this. It's totally different, other than the fact that it's serialized. And so technically, Dark Shadows is a soap opera, but I find it has a lot more in common with something you addressed in the blog, which is Varney the Vampire, the serialized, those Gothic tales, those penny dreadfuls, were Shilling Shockers and all that were serialized tales of the supernatural. And Varney was the first sympathetic vampire. Barnabas is the first like one that made an atomic bomb impact on vampire culture. But Varney actually predates Barnabas, as does Dracula's Daughter and a couple other examples. But this is where I think Dark Shadows kind of did separate itself from the traditional soap opera. This is from your blog. The de facto head writer on Dark Shadows was Dan Curtis, and to get through to him, you had to connect to something he liked. Dan didn't care about soap operas. He never produced any others, as far as I know. He never even watched one. Dan knew Universal Monsters, Hammer Horror, and the classics of English lit. And then you go on. The way this is another entry. The way we even talk about Dark Shadows, the 1897, 1840 parallel time, 1970 Leviathan story arcs is nothing like how people discuss soap operas. Soaps are primarily character-based, with people sitting around recapping and discussing their feelings. DS did do some of that prior to Barnabas taking over the show, but I don't see returning to that as a formula for success. So my question is, when we look at Dark Shadows as a soap opera, and you talk about comic books being soap operas and these current TV shows being soap operas, is there a distinction between serialized storytelling and soap operas? Is there a difference between, because I tend to refer to Dark Shadows as a serial, because if you invoke the soap opera phrase sometimes, especially to horror fans, are like, oh, I'm not going to watch a soap opera. But it's like, but it's unfortunate, but it's like, well, that's judging just based on a slang phrase for it's a serialized story. So is there a difference between a soap opera and a serialized story? Where does Dark Shadows fall into that?
I think when we talk about soap opera, the most important thing about serialized fiction is that it's being produced at the same time that people are experiencing it. It's not like you write a whole novel and then you just release it in sections like that. Yeah, that's a serial, but it's not the same thing. Like what matters, and this so much mattered with Dark Shadows, was that as kind of serialized narrative, they were producing the show and then they were getting information from the viewers about what they wanted. Like that's why they ended up going for Laura. It's why they ended up going for Barnabas, because the ratings were going down, and they had a plan to like have Barnabas on for like 6 weeks or 13 weeks and then kill him off. And what they found was, people really loved him. They really, like, Jonathan Frid was just fascinating to watch. And so we wanted to just keep watching him. Like, and that's how he became the main character of the show, is that they were paying attention to kind of what were the viewers doing and what were the viewers really responding to. That is, I think, the fun of soap opera and the fun of serialized narratives. And like superhero comics is the same, that they try different things. They try a new costume, they try the new characters coming in, and kind of long term what happens is that the good characters survive and keep going, and the boring characters kind of get left behind. That very much happened to Dark Shadows. So that's my serialized narrative thing. Soap opera specifically, the structure of soap opera is multiple overlapping plots that continue over time, and that kind of like intersect at various times. So like a very soap opera period is 1897, when there's just so many different things happening, and you as a viewer are kind of tracking like what Laura is doing and what Quentin is doing and what Angelique is doing and who has the will, and all there's all these things that like come up as new characters come in. It's that structure that is the soap opera.
I see.
That's and the thing that people think of when you talk about daytime soap operas is like the content, specifically like who those characters are and what they're doing. And Dark Shadows is very different content, or becomes very different content wise.
Yeah.
Especially around love, which Dark Shadows has really very little interest in for the most part. Because there's no such thing, on kind of regular daytime soap operas. They're more focused on marriages and births and divorces and kind of and love stories, kind of people coming together and splitting apart again. And Dark Shadows is not that interested in, like, it's definitely not interested in weddings. It's not interested in babies. It's not which I think ultimately kind of leads towards when it stops working as a show.
So Dan, it's great. So I mean, Dan Curtis, and I always say this on the podcast, Dan Curtis used the soap opera structure to basically do what he wanted, what he liked, which was
let's tell Jekyll and Hyde.
Jekyll and Hyde and Turn of the Screw and all this other stuff that he dug. Then he was like, well, let's work this into the story, and it just became this interwoven, reimagining of all these horror classics, and kind of with their own ideas also mixed in, of course. And that probably does. You're probably right too, in terms of like why Dark Shadows ended, other than everybody being kind of wanting to move on to things and stuff.
Well, so there are things. So this is a thing that I read about. Like there are things that they could have done. Yeah. When you say like they ran out of story, like it's not possible to run out of story.
Right.
Dan says the silly thing at one point of like, well, there's really only 7 stories in the world, which is just clearly not true in any way. I don't even know what you're talking about. But there are things that they could have done in that like later year and a half that they just didn't have any interest in, which was just introducing new families and becoming more like a traditional soap, just in the sense of like people come in and we establish like another family that's here, and we take that family seriously. And I think like the point where it really breaks is Jeb and Carolyn at the end of the Leviathan story. There is such an important moment that should happen between them. Which is she finds out, and she has a chance to react as this crucial character who we've known since the very beginning. they rob her of that experience, and they rob us of kind of a real ending to that story.
Yeah. And Danny is talking about Carolyn finding out that Jeb killed
Jeb is
Paul,
a monster.
and that he killed Paul Stoddard. Yeah.
Right.
You're right. I agree with you there. I
And
wish
Jeb
that
kind
she could
of
have.
comes, and that all gets wrapped up, and Carolyn is just sort of a passenger. That says to me like they weren't really that interested in Carolyn and what happens to Carolyn over time, which I think is a shame. They could have had her deal with that as a problem, bring in new people, and like Quentin needs some sexy nieces and nephews at a certain point coming in, because he spent all that time wandering the world,
right,
having illegitimate children, obviously. So it would be so easy to like bring in more family members, and then to actually like invest in those stories and see what happens over time.
Do you think the audience, like the kids running home from school to watch Dark Shadow, you think they would have been into that? Like if it wasn't focused on the Collins family anymore and focused on somebody else, do you think they would have still been interested in it?
I mean, that is kind of what they did.
Yeah,
with
well,
1841
yeah, I guess.
is create a new family, but it was a super boring family and nothing.
It was the 1841
I think
family.
people were into the cliffhangers. People were into it, which is such a huge, like, it's such a huge part of soap opera and Dark Shadows as a soap opera. Everything leads up to the big cliffhanger once a week, or as with Dark Shadows, eventually like every single day, it's got to end on some major point of tension. Right. And they kind of broke that by kind of leaving our family behind.
Yes. Yeah. And that was, I've talked about this in previous episodes. I don't know if you've heard, I did an episode with Elena Nicanther, who was Jonathan Frid's assistant when in the 60s and 70s during the run of the show. And I've had Mary O'Leary on too and talked to her about this. There, in her documentary, she shows a letter, the Jonathan Frid story, where Dan Curtis fired Jonathan Frid because he didn't want to do Night of Dark Shadows. Dan Curtis was furious that Jonathan Frid didn't want to do Night of Dark Shadows. So Dan Curtis's people, Jonathan Frid's people came back with, well, you can't fire Jonathan. He still has this many months left on his contract. So Dan's idea was, well, if you're not going to play Barnabas in the movie, you're not going to play him on TV. So that's supposedly why because for years fans were like, oh, Jonathan Frid insisted on playing a new character. Supposedly it was actually Curtis who was like, nope, he's going to play. And that's why 1841 Parallel Time came into existence. So there was a lot going on there at that time. I think that's insane. Can you imagine firing like your star attraction from the show? Because I think you got it. I think you would. Barnabas had to stay on. Like even if they introduced a new family, I think Barnabas still has to be part of whatever, a key part of whatever is going on.
One thing that I talk about a bunch is thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, which is essentially like you need, if you want this show, if you want this story to continue, you need to keep bringing in energy from the outside. That keeps it going. Otherwise, if it's just like a little bottle that's kind of like running without any new stuff coming in, eventually it leads to entropy. And everything just gets boring and flat, which is, so 1841 Parallel Time essentially was this little like bubble that didn't have more energy coming in. It was sort of just this one story, weird kind of gloomy story that they wanted to tell that wasn't that interesting. And kind of just like all the energy leaked out from the show. And I think that's kind of what kills the show. So they could have kept it going, but they would have to turn it, kind of lean more back into daytime soap opera than what the show had become. And so it's like, and that was just not the show that Dan wanted to make anymore. That wasn't the show that even I think like Sam Hall and Gordon Russell were interested in making. Although they did, like, the next thing that those guys did was just go into more soap operas. Like they worked on One Life to Live.
Oh, Sam Hall and Gordon Russell.
Yeah.
And then Dan went on to do The Night Stalker and
horror stuff.
Horror stuff on TV, king of TV horror in the 70s for sure. So sometimes your opinion. I've read the comments, sometimes I enjoyed reading the comments on your blog, which were often just as insightful as your write-ups. There were some really good
folks are brilliant
responses. Yeah. Although sometimes I know some people were, I guess sometimes it could be a bit irreverent sometimes, like Ron Sproat, for example. I know you're not the biggest fan of Ron Sproat or Addison Powell, things. And you could get a little irreverent sometimes. And I think sometimes people may have misinterpreted that. So can you address some of that? Like, I know one time you posted something like somebody stopped reading the blog or something because they thought you didn't really like Dark Shadows because you were joking around about, and that's, I think that's over. I've had people with my podcast do that too. Like, I'm always, you made fun of the Tim Burton movie. Right. I love that movie. I'm no longer listening to your podcast. I'm like, it's okay to have your opinion, and I can have my opinion. I'm not saying you're not a fan if you don't like the Tim Burton movie, if you do like the Tim Burton movie. Anyway, can you address that?
Sure. Well, I think that one thing that I know is like controversial on the blog, a thing that people disagree and get mad about is what I write about Vicky. That she's a huge mess of a character. Everything that she does is wrong. She makes terrible decisions all of the time. She never is like making the smart choice, and things kind of collapse around her. And so I think I've got like at least a couple posts that are called Vicky Ruins Everything.
Yes. Yeah.
And I just like, and I think that compared to the kaiju, Alexander Molka is just not fun to watch in the way that like Barnabas and Julia, Quentin and Angelique are. And it was fun for me to follow that thread and just kind of like keep making fun of Alexander Molka and of Vicky, which I found very funny. But I know that there are people who are big Vicky fans and who disagree and who who are mad at me about that. And there's a point where I was just writing my blog. It's my interpretation of what I'm looking at on screen, and Addison Powell is terrible.
I find him entertaining, but he's definitely over the top. But I find, and I like Vicky. I think she's sharper in the pre-Barnabas episodes, but
absolutely,
but I had Patrick McRae on in the last episode, and he made a nice point too. Like, well, if we were dropped into that situation, with getting whisked back and forth in time, and ghosts and witches and stuff, like, we also wouldn't understand. So we wouldn't understand that. We only understand it because we're watching Dark Shadows. So but I know what you're saying. Sometimes it's like, Vicky, come on,
you are not seeing the things that are right in front of you.
You're right. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Last of some geeky questions. Well, actually, this whole conversation has been pretty geeky, but that's okay.
Please go ahead.
That's what it's all about, right? All right. So, if there were going to be a crossover between the Muppets and Dark Shadows, which Muppets character or characters would you want to see show up in Dark Shadows?
That's such a funny question. Well, my favorite character of the Muppets is Miss Piggy, for very similar reasons to my love for Julia and Angelique on Dark Shadows.
Okay.
Just a really like very, very funny and very pushy and smart and keeps things moving. That's a thing that Miss Piggy does. It's a thing that Frank Oz did, like always wanted to push for. What's the funny thing that we can do here? How do I make this like interview, this, on a talk show funnier? And it's either like picking a fight with the host or flirting with the host or both. And so she's kind of like this destabilizing force where people don't, at any moment, Miss Piggy could kind of like wreck whatever it is that we're doing. And I think, the kaiju characters in Dark Shadows, that's what they do. Is they walk into a room and they can just change what's happening just from the sheer force of their appeal, and kind of the craziness that they bring.
Okay. So Miss Piggy is your choice then?
Yeah, she would be in there.
Miss Piggy and Julia and Angelique duel. battle.
Miss Piggy, if you think about like Miss Piggy and Angelique dueling each other,
I could totally
not
picture that.
not dissimilar. Yeah, that kind of in a weird way that kind of works.
I was gonna say Uncle Deadly seems to be kind of the obvious
Uncle
choice.
Deadly could like yeah could sneak around.
I could see him hanging out with like Professor Stokes or something. Um, um, what about superheroes? Is there a superhero Dark Shadows
Gosh,
crossover
crossover that you
character?
could do. Um, I'm not sure. Do you have
Okay.
anything?
I can't think of a good one
It's
off the
just it's
top
a
of my head.
different
It's
yeah.
such a different thing. I mean, the comics wise, like the Marvel monsters, I think those there was some inspiration
Oh,
from
that is
Dark
true.
Shadows going on
Yeah.
there. I mean,
Yeah,
they're
Werewolf
monsters.
by Night. Yeah, you're
Werewolf
right.
by Night, yeah.
Werewolf by Night is actually I believe kind of was very influenced, you know, ripped off, influenced, etc. Werewolf by Night is very kind of like Barnabas and Quentin as a werewolf.
Hmm.
Um trying to Jack Russell trying to do his best
Yeah,
uh in
yeah,
the world, but also turns into a werewolf and kills people.
yeah. And it's the Dark Shadows doesn't. I feel like Dark Shadows doesn't get enough credit for the influence it's had on
Yeah,
pop culture.
yeah, I agree.
What do you think it would take to see Dark Shadows kind of come back into its own in terms of the pop culture zeitgeist?
Yeah. Um I don't think it's going to. I
Yeah.
think yeah, I think the thing that gets people into Dark Shadows is watching it every day, and
Hmm.
seeing how it unfolds. It's a commitment that you have to make, which, like, for us in the 80s, there weren't that many other things on. Like, Dark Shadows was the most interesting thing on.
Yeah.
Um, and I didn't have, other choices, in the way that I do now. Like, basically now we have the opportunity to watch almost everything that has ever been made.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of it. And so you've always got choices. I think, like, for us, sort of in the 80s on public TV, it like narrows that down, and so allowed us to focus on like this strange, slow but amazing thing happening every day in
Hmm.
front of us. And you and I had that same experience of watching it every day,
Hmm.
and it becoming like something that we love and part of our lives. um and I think on the Sci-Fi Channel, when it was airing, like, that I think was very, very similar, that people kind of got into that habit of watching it every day, and then it seeps into you.
Yeah.
um and we don't have anything that is gonna like narrow options down like that
Hmm.
anymore. Like, I don't think there's gonna be a situation where anybody, like, it just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
um of like a rerun like airing all the time, and people seeing it over time.
Yeah. You have to seek it out. Like it's on
Yeah,
Tubi. Like I know it's on
yeah,
Tubi free
exactly.
with ads. And it's like you have to consciously like I have to find this on this thing. What
But people
about
do I mean, people do discover it, and there are
sure.
there are new fans who come. And I know, again, just the fact that people are like still reading my blog, and uh come, and I can tell are like watching the show, and then coming and like watching the episode, then coming in and read the post about it, and then they'll post a comment. um there's definitely people who like who when they're clued into it and how amazing it is, um that come in and adore it the way that we do.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's that, like, the mass audience is just not going to happen.
Right. I actually just heard from a fan in the UK who discovered it. I think it was like on Amazon or something. She like during the pandemic, she
Yeah,
discovered Dark Shadows and she loves it. She just
yeah,
got completely sucked into it. So you're right. Yeah, people are still finding it. What about I always bring up this the idea of the Dark Shadows reincarnation that Mark B. Perry
right,
is
the reboot.
still he just posted he's still now that the
Yeah.
writer's strike's over he's back at it to try
Oh, is he
to try
really? Oh, that's great.
yes yeah so how do you feel about that like to me I think that could also lead to an influx of people who may
Mhm.
want to check out the like Doctor Who like the new Doctor Who kind of
Right,
led
right.
to
Got
people
people
going
to, yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, history.
yeah
his,
those are all
his
reboots though this is a
history
sequel.
shows. No, yeah, that's the thing, is that history shows that when you try to reboot, when you try to tell the story over again, the way that they have in all of the reimaginings of it, where it's about Barnabas and Vicky, which is never that's not actually the story. And it hasn't worked. It doesn't work as an actual like story that makes sense unless you're improvising it every single day. Like you would never sit down and write the structure of that story the way that Dark Shadows fans want to see it. But like, basically the way to make Dark Shadows is to make something new. Like that was what they did every day. That was sort of the energy coming in, the ideas coming in, and experimenting and playing and seeing what worked and what didn't work, pulling back on the Leviathans because everybody hated Leviathans, like bringing Quentin to the fore because everybody loved Quentin. That kind of like mix and match, playing around and experimenting is what Dark Shadows was, as this weird little television laboratory to see what happens if we can be the craziest thing on television and pay attention to what people are responding to. So the idea of like going back and doing it again is kind of the opposite of Dark Shadows. It's saying this is a static thing that we have decided, and then we're gonna try and do that, get people involved in it. It just has never worked. If what Mark's doing is really like moving on from that and saying this, we started this place, but then we are going to go and tell our own stories and do our own new thing. I think it definitely has like potential, and it could really go someplace. I think the Big Finish audios to some degree did that, and I think they were very good and very successful.
Yeah, that's in audio form. Yeah, they did do a sequel, sequelized Dark Shadows and continued the story. I like the idea of like everything that happened in the show still happened, but now we would find out what's going on now, what happened in the interim, etc. You can explore other time periods, other characters. Recast Barnabas or not?
It's
like, is Barnabas part of
the story?
To. Yeah. So
I don't know. It really depends on what kind of new story there is to tell here, and kind of why you want to bring it back.
Yeah.
Taking like Barnabas, Julia Quentin, Angelique, and Gerard towards the end as these like amazing characters developed over time.
Yeah.
And part of what makes each of those special is that they all started out as the villain or the antagonist. And then over time, became deeper and more interesting, and therefore got more attention and more development. We watched all of those things, and it's so delicious to watch those things emerge and then start interacting with each other. So those are characters that that we as Dark Shadows fans really love. Anybody who watches the show is going to love those characters, and so you take that to a new series, and you say, well, it's got to have Barnabas and Julia and Quentin and Angelique, and it's like, nobody knows who those characters are. Right. Those are very weird characters that don't 100% make sense. And so like, why would the new audience pick that up? I think the best example of a reboot really working is Doctor Who, which did an amazing job of saying, this is a continuation. Everything that happened before this is true now, from like 2005 on to now. Like it's all been one big story with a gap in between. But Russell T Davies also looked at what's the most essential things that we need in order to make that Doctor Who, and how do we make that modern TV? And so it didn't like bring back a whole bunch of characters from before. It really was like new monsters. It brought the Daleks back because you had to, because that was the huge, I don't know if you know Doctor Who at all.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
But for the most part, like really was just telling new stories in a really completely new style. And the only thing that was the same is just like the Doctor and the Companion and the TARDIS, and you can go anywhere in time and space and fight monsters.
Yeah.
I think if you're going to remake Dark Shadows, if you're going to, start again, you have to go in with that spirit of like, which of these characters do we really need, and why do we need them? And how are we going to get folks involved in like what's happening right now, kind of moving forward?
Right.
It's totally possible. I would love to see, and I would love to learn more about like what he's doing. I think it would be, I read like what he wrote in Daytime Gothic, but I would love to know like what's the plan, what's the actual story that you would tell.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. I hope he's very determined to do it. He's not going to give up on it.
Oh, fantastic! Oh, that's good.
So what we shall, with all these streaming services out there, I assume, somebody has to give it a shot.
Yeah.
People have asked me in the past with this podcast to do Dark Shadows to do one episode devoted to each episode of Dark Shadows, which would take, even if I did a weekly podcast, would take like 23 years, which is insane. I was going to ask you though, is that something you've ever considered doing? Is because you're doing the superheroes podcast now, which is fantastic. Have you ever thought about doing a Dark Shadows podcast?
I really, the idea of Dark Shadows Every Day was to say everything that I have to say about Dark Shadows.
Okay.
That I wanted to find places, and that's why there were all these like side trips and bringing in other stuff. I wanted to, talk about the comic strip and the comic book and the novels and all this, basically, and all the reboots and everything, all of that up until episode 1245. And then I'm done, and I don't have anything to say.
Okay.
Okay. And so, so what I'm, writing about in Daytime Gothic is now I don't want to sound like people go and read Daytime Gothic because it's brilliant. But my parts, I'm sort of like taking themes and things that like I wrote about but didn't kind of put into one place. That's been kind of what I've done in Daytime Gothic is like, so I've got, I don't have a new thing to say, but I've got kind of like a repackaging and a new look at something that I've already written about. So yeah, I can't come back to Dark Shadows like as a podcast or anything unless I come up with like actually new things to say about it.
I see. Okay.
I love it so much, and I miss doing in a lot of ways the Dark Shadows blog because I loved writing it, and I'm so happy that it's there for people to read. But I think it's everything I had to say about it.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, folks, you definitely want to check out Danny's Dark Shadows blog. I will put a link to it in the show notes. I will also put a link to the Superheroes Everyday podcast and blog. And where can we find Superheroes Everyday, Danny?
It is at superheroeseveryday.com. So there's a blog where I am writing about every superhero movie starting from the beginning in great detail. So far it's just been Superman, Superman 2, Swamp Thing, and Superman 3, which I am now kind of in the middle of. If you like my writing from Dark Shadows Every Day, the superheroes blog is very similar. It's real funny, and I hope that people discover it and love it. And then also for the last like 6 months or so, instead of writing the blog, I started making a podcast because that turns out to be really fun too. So folks can find the blog at superheroeseveryday.com. And then the Superheroes Everyday podcast is available on Spotify and on all of the, Apple Podcasts and Google and all of the places where you find your podcasts.
Great. And again, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Are you going to cover like the older superhero movies? Like, so George Reeves was a Superman versus
like Batman and Superman stuff?
Yeah. And is that in the cards, or are you focused starting with 70s? And
the idea was start with, it's actually kind of similar to starting Dark Shadows Every Day with 210. It's like what I was interested in is like the blockbuster movies and kind of how does it go from here.
Okay, gotcha. All right, cool. Well,
but I'm also for the podcast, I'm going to take a little season break, and when I come back, I might be doing like I'm thinking about bringing in other kinds of movies as well, not just superhero movies.
Oh, interesting.
Something about like The Hunger Games and John Carter and Twilight. Like there's a whole bunch of like not superhero blockbusters that I would actually love to have the chance to like dive into and have fun with.
Wonderful. Cool.
Yeah.
Well,
so come check it out.
Yeah, look forward to that. Danny, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to chat with you today. I've had a blast talking to you, and I know
me too.
I know fans are going to love hearing from you. Absolutely. So thank you. And folks, please do remember to rate and review the podcast. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Prime, Spotify, wherever you can rate the podcast, please do so. That does help the podcast to reach more listeners. And if you're watching on YouTube, there is a video version of this. So if you're watching on YouTube, please do like and subscribe to the podcast. I would certainly appreciate it. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much.
And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.